you'll notice that you're getting a message that the webinar is being recorded. So we do record these so that we can share them later. If you're not comfortable with that, then make sure you don't unmute and turn on your camera. So if you want to click that you're happy with that, that would be great. And I will do the same. So we'll just give people another couple of minutes to come into the room. Got a few people joining. So welcome to everyone. And we're just at 2 o'clock European time now, so I think we will give it just one more minute or so before we start with the webinar. Okay, so I see the numbers are still coming up a little bit. We'll just give another couple of seconds for this, for people to join. So welcome everyone. And I think Rita will maybe start when we get, just to about 2 more minutes from now. Yeah, thanks very much, Rita. So welcome everyone to this Ferris Fair Repository Support webinar. Today we will be looking at using DCAT, the Data Catalogue Vocabulary, to support metadata catalog integration. So before we go on, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an intro before we move on beyond this. So what we are hoping to get across today is that one of the things that is really crucial for realizing the FAIR data ecosystem, where researchers can find, access, reuse, and cite data, a really key part of that is their ability to, number one, find data that is held in multiple different repositories in different countries across the globe. They need to be able to find it so that they know what they can use. So metadata catalogues, or the ability to describe the holdings held within a repository, are a really crucial aspect about making sure that people can find what's in a repository, and more importantly, that these can be pulled together so that people can search across different repository holdings. So aggregator services play a key role in pulling together different metadata catalogs from the different services and making them searchable in a single sort of seamless way. So this is something that we see as being really a key part of enabling a sort of a seamless research infrastructure. But at the moment, integration is hindered because there's a lack of common use of standards. So in the Ferris Fair project, we have been looking in a very small pilot at some of the standards that are currently being used, and DCAT is one of them. So we will give you a little flavor of some of the work we did and the recommendations that have come out from our pilots. But the main part of today's session is really going to be introducing you to DCAT and giving you that sense about what it is and how it can be used to support integration of metadata catalogs. And we'll hear a little bit more about that from the speakers later on. So one thing I wanted to do just before we go on too much is to give you a flavor of Ferris Fair. So I am from the Ferris Fair project. It's a Horizon 2020 project. We are due to finish up in just over a week's time. And we are all about really emphasizing fostering good data practices to realize a fair data ecosystem. And all of this is hopefully to help realize the vision of the European Open Science Cloud. So we have 3 work packages that are looking primarily to support repositories. I lead one of them, which is data policy and practice. And these repository support webinars are really intended to help people in the community, especially those repositories who might be smaller and less well-resourced, to kind of get a sense of some of the activities that are going on and things that could help them to become more fair enabling. So that's a little bit about what we're hoping to get out of it. Before we go into the session itself, I'll maybe just remind people to mute yourselves if you're not speaking. And before we go into the actual presentations, we just wanted to get a sense of who's joining us today. So if I could ask people to go to menti.com and enter the code 20733730, that would be great. And I will just open this Menti. And the first thing, I don't know if maybe somebody can add the link in the chat there. It's 20733730 is the code that we want you to enter into Menti. And the first thing we want to know from you is, who are you? Which of these options best describes your service? Are you a national repository, institutional repository, domain-specific repository, metadata aggregator, or other? And if you're one of those choosing other, we'd love it if you would put it into the chat. Just let us know where you're coming from, just so we get a sense of who's in the room. At the moment, it looks like we've got quite a good representation from the institutional repositories, but also quite a few who are ticking that sort of other category. So it'll be interesting to know who is in the room. I'll give you another couple of minutes just to add your information. I'm glad to see we've got some metadata aggregators joining us today. I think that obviously is a key role for us to be able to reach out to as well. So that's great. So I think we've got 64 participants, and about half of the people have added. So I'll just give you one more minute if you want to add to this Menti poll before we move on to the next question. But so far, I think we've seen the institutional side is taking a lead. So we're glad to see a lot of institutional repositories who are joining here today and trying to become more FAIR enabling, because it isn't just the national and domain-specific repositories that have a role to play here. It is definitely, I think, the institutional repositories where a lot of researchers turn to first for local support. So I think, Eva, yes, we need a few other categories that we can add. So that's something we can take into consideration. So thanks to everybody. I think we'll move on now. You can continue adding to the Menti afterwards if you want for the final record. The next question that we wanted to get a sense from you is whether you currently have a data catalog, some way for people to browse through and search the contents of your repository. So it looks like most of you are in the category of having that. Quite a few are not yet in the position of having a data catalog. So hopefully today you'll learn a little bit about some of the things you might want to consider in moving forward in that respect. So for those of you who do have catalogs, it's great to see that we've got quite a lot of people already making the contents of their repositories visible. And I think Eva's put into the chat there, you'll probably notice that we flip back and forth between data and metadata catalogs. And I think that is a terminology point that we've kind of grappled with. So they're a little bit interchangeable for us at this point. So great to see, as I said before, you can continue adding your responses if you haven't had a chance to add it yet. And if you've put again, feel free to put it into the chat. We'd love to hear a bit more. The last question I have before we move into the talks themselves is just to get a sense of how many people joining today are familiar with DCAT. If you're very familiar with it, it seems like quite a few of you are. Some of you have heard of it, but don't really know what it's all about. Quite a few of you have never heard of it. So I think hopefully today, whether you've heard of it before and are very familiar with it, or you're just kind of getting started and want to know more, hopefully you'll leave today with a better understanding of DCAT and the most recent version of DCAT. And that will hopefully give you some information that you can start to take back to your workplace and start to think about how it might be relevant for you in sharing your data catalogs. So I think I'm going to stop sharing there. Please feel free to continue adding into the Menti. We'll keep it open. But for the next few minutes, I think what we will do is hand over to Eva Mendez, my colleague on Ferris Fair from UC3M in Madrid. And she and my colleague Simon Lambert, who's also on the call from STFC, did some work to look at a pilot on the potential feasibility of DCAT for supporting metadata catalog integration. And so I'm going to hand over to Eva, and she will give us a little overview of what we did in that pilot and some of the recommendations. So over to you, Eva.
Okay, thank you very much, Joy. It is a big pleasure for me to present what we have been doing in the Ferris Fair project. Simon from STFC and myself, and our teams, of course, on the overview of the metadata catalog integration, of data catalog integration. It was a big discussion in the first workshop that we organized about what is the data catalog of a metadata catalog. But at the end of the day, metadata are data, so we can just confirm that we are talking more or less about the same. Well, you know the FAIR principles, and you know that they mention many times metadata. Metadata is the way we talk about the organization of your research data repositories, your research data infrastructure, your research data. We talk about metadata and data. But my point, or our point here, is that the FAIR data guiding principles is more or less all about metadata. I always said that when we talk about FAIR principles, it's very easy to talk about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But at the end, it is 80% of metadata and 20% of PIDs. And then I have a discussion with Barry Mons, and we said, well, we can negotiate the percentage, but metadata will never be minor than 70% of the work that we have to do to make our data fair. So this is what we want to show up in the deliverables that they were dealing with the metadata catalog integration, that the metadata are at the core of data. And even if there are many standards, the REA has then a metadata standards directory by disciplines, and all the disciplines, they have their own standards in their own domain. But it's a crucial topic, and it's more difficult to make standards for everybody to take a transversal view of the approach of making data fair. And also metadata are the data lifecycle and the core of the data reporting. We can just work with a simple metadata paradigm as well. Who, what, when, where, how, why the data were developed and for what. And also it's a way of a data communication on the way you provide information for others to find your data, and the way that you want to receive the data sets that they are reusable for you. So if we miss this metadata, we miss the communication between the data producer and the potential data reuser. So that's why we thought that this is such a crucial work that we have been doing here. But unfortunately, when you look at the scientific research data landscape, they are domains that they are very big on data management. They have big infrastructures. They have big domains. They manage within the silo of the domain perfectly their metadata. But there is also a very big long tail of sciences, of the repositories. For example, the university libraries, you have repositories that is, or Zenodo is the gathering of the long tail of science, or the repository for the homeless. If you don't have a big domain that has a big infrastructure, where do you have to deposit your data? Where are the metadata that you have to deal with in a transversal way? So we go back to the problem that every domain wants to use their own metadata standard. So what we have done in the first step of the Ferris Fair Work Package 3, dealing with metadata catalog integration, was addressing these big infrastructures, the clusters, and think about how we can create this metadata layer that can transversally help to different big domains, or even the long tail of science, to share data, probably losing the specificity of the domain, but on behalf of potential discoverability among domains, which is not an easy thing. So the first approach that we came up with was trying to integrate metadata catalogs using DDI, CDI for a specific perspective, or using DCAT from a generic transversal perspective. And we address this with aggregators like B2Find, and also in the piloting of integration metadata, which is what the work that my colleague Simon was leading on reporting on this integration of metadata catalogs with the specific examples. So in that, we worked with two big cluster projects, the Social Science and Humanities cluster and the PANOS, which is the photon and neutron community. So we also asked the service providers, B2Find and OpenAir, and also we find out that it's a positive attitude to DCAT as a standard to solve the toothbrush effect. It is a potential role to have DCAT as supporting the aggregation and findability of the data or metadata catalogs, and also the good thing or the good approach will be combining DDI, CDI for the specific domain level and DCAT for generic level of transversal interoperability within different domains. If we have to think over other fundings and challenges that we have been addressing in this work that we have been doing in Ferris Fair, we have to stop on the implications of the difference between research domains and what is inter, trans, cross, multidisciplinarity approaches, which is not very clear for every of the domains. Some people think that they have cross-disciplinary research within the same domain between photon and neutron with closed domains, but within the same big discipline. And sometimes they think that they have standards, but what they have is the likelihood to become a standard. And also there is another issue about metadata quality, which is not only at a schema level, the metadata formats or the metadata attributes and elements, but also at the level of semantic artifacts that is more engaged on ontologies and content-oriented vocabularies. And also, we have to think over the good research outcomes have to have good metadata. But defining what is good metadata is a big issue. And DCAT is one of the approaches that balance the approach of very good quality with the transdisciplinary approaches. And also there is a requirement of sustainability, and also is a requirement of demand. If people demand this layer of transversal discoverability far on that the main FAIR principles. So I think the EOSC challenge is absolutely to go through different domains, where I said always that is where the eureka happens. When you don't know where the data that they are there is when you really can find something that it wasn't on your mind, that it was already there. So I think DCAT could help to this discoverability farther or a step forward than the findability of the FAIR interdomain principles applied to metadata. And I think that was a quick overview. And we are very happy to give the floor to our biggest stars today, that for sure they are the ones that they are going to tell us from the very perspective of DCAT, how they show this, this landscape that we were thinking on in Ferris Fair. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Eva. And just to pick up on one of the points you raised, when we were looking at the feasibility of DCAT, it did come across as nobody we spoke to had any reasons not to think it might be useful for metadata integration. But one of the things, and I think it was on your last slide, is that currently as some of the aggregators that we spoke to, and we only spoke to a couple, made clear that there's currently not a demand from the repository community to harvest in DCAT. So one of the reasons we wanted to run this workshop was just to make repositories more aware of the fact that DCAT does offer this potential for catalog integration and to try and raise awareness of how it might be used. So hopefully that will help to address one of those gaps. So that was great, just to give you the sense of what Ferris Fair is thinking along the lines of the feasibility of DCAT. Now we wanted to hand over to two speakers who have joined us to give us more on what DCAT is all about. So they're going to give us more on the role of DCAT in supporting metadata catalog integration, and also to give us a summary of some of the changes that have emerged. DCAT is now going into version 3, and there have been, as the standard has progressed. There have been changes to try and make it more useful to different user communities. So we'll hear a little bit about some of the changes that have come up. So we'll have two speakers for the next session. Alejandra Gonzalez Beltran, who is from STFC and UKRI, and also Peter Winstonley from Semantic Arts. So I think it'll be Alejandra first. So I will hand over to you, Alejandra.
Okay, thank you, Joy, and thank you, everyone. So first of all, yeah, we wanted to thank the organizers for inviting us to talk about DCAT. So as Joy said, I'm Alejandra González Beltrán. I work in the Science and Technology Facilities Council in the UK. And one of the main roles in our group, so I lead the Data and Software Engineering group, and we work with the large facilities for their data management platforms. So I'm involved in one of the communities that Eva mentioned, the photon and neutron community. And Peter, you want to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to Joy, Eva, Simon, and everybody else for such a warm welcome. I work with a company called Semantic Arts, and we deal with all manner of organizations, including research organizations, that want to organize their information assets very generally using semantic technologies. So we do actually implement with DCAT in large multinationals. So as a kind of backdrop to all of this, whilst we're going to be talking about the research world, please don't think that this is only for the research world. It's actually extremely general, and many of you who work in research areas also connect with the wider world, and so they will also be pleased with the fact that your catalogues can be interoperable with what they might be doing.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Peter. So as Joy said, we're both going to present. I'll start by describing what DCAT is and mention a bit about its evolution. And then Peter will move on to giving more examples and how you go about implementing DCAT if you are interested in that. So to start with, indeed, I mean, it was in the previous presentation mentioned some of the needs that in different organizations that DCAT addresses. So all organizations have a need to have their information organized and make it discoverable. And also with the movement to open data, we need a vocabulary to describe it on the web. This is not to say that DCAT can also be used to describe data that is not open, by the way, and in different domains. We also need vocabularies to describe catalogues that hold the data, and especially the ability to search across those catalogues and to aggregate data from different catalogues. So all of these needs are things that DCAT aimed to cover, and I will go through the different versions and how it's doing this with increasing detail. So next, I do want to mention that, so this is DCAT in a nutshell. So when you leave this webinar, what you should know is that DCAT is a vocabulary that facilitates the interoperability aspects between the resource catalogs. So indeed, by having the same vocabulary, the same standard of describing the resources, and in particularly the data, then you are able to have the same way of querying different catalogs and integrating data. So that's one of the main points. So it enables publishers of data sets and data services, and you'll see that this is one of the additions in the more recent versions, to use a standard model to describe what is available in different catalogs. It allows to discover data more easily and enables searching across, as we discussed. So this is federated search. As it was mentioned it's domain agnostic, so it's very generic and it can be applied to any domain, and it can be combined with domain-specific vocabularies that will describe the domain-specific data. Originally, so the first version was more centered around governmental data or public data portals. And in the subsequent versions, we have focused on the requirements for research data. But as Peter mentioned, it also can cover any other type of data, including industrial data. So the main thing is that it creates a vocabulary when it's needed, but when there are existing vocabularies, we reuse those. And this includes then terms from Dublin Core and the provenance ontology, for example. So whenever there is a vocabulary that is suitable for the use case, that is being used. By the way, I don't think we mentioned, but Peter and I are in this webinar with our hat of editors of the DCAT vocabulary. So this is where we are coming from in this case. So the first version of DCAT was approved as a recommendation from W3C in 2014. And the vocabulary, as you see, it was fairly small, covering properties from Dublin Core when it's needed, and you can see here these prefixes, and adding vocabulary for the things that weren't covered by Dublin Core. So the main entities that added to existing vocabulary, so these are proper DCAT entities, are the concept of the catalogue, so a description of a set of data sets that are associated, the concept of catalogue record, so it's the information for being a record in a catalogue, and I know, I believe Peter is giving examples on these points, and the two also very fundamental classes that it added was data set and distribution. So the data set as the description of the data more as a conceptual or abstract entity, and the distribution being really the actual representation of the data set. For example, the same data set could be available in multiple distributions if it is in different formats. So you can consider a spreadsheet in a proprietary format and a spreadsheet in a CSV file. So the content is the same, so it's the same data set, but these are considered different distributions in DCAT. So as we described, this came more out of use cases related to the governmental data, and it's the adoption of the first version was mainly around European data portals and governmental portals all around. So, but that version, it started to be insufficient for other use cases. For example, how we could describe APIs or automatic programmatic ways of accessing data sets. The description of temporal aspects of the data sets were missing, relationship between catalogs, relationship between data sets, versions, etc. And we met in 2016 in the Smart Descriptions and Smart Vocabulary workshop, and we discussed all of these. And after that meeting, it came the new working group that Peter and I have been involved with, as well as many others, of course, in which we started dealing with the new use cases for the required new version of DCAT. I did mention about the adoption of DCAT, so especially the first version, and there are many different flavors of extensions of DCAT and which add additional constraints. So this is the DCAT application profile for data portals, public data portals. There are specific flavors looking at geographical data and statistical data, specific flavors per country, etc. So, I mean, there are plenty of implementations out there and extensions of DCAT for different purposes. So going back to the need of an extension of what it was the first version of DCAT, so there is an original charter and the mission of the W3C Dataset Exchange Working Group. That was to revise DCAT, taking into account related vocabularies and all of the points I mentioned earlier that were missing from the first version. In addition, we first set out to also work on defining application profiles and guidance on how to use them. So the first step into a new recommendation is to gather all the use cases and requirements. And this is available as the first note from the working group from January 2019 that compiles the initial set of use cases and requirements that got us started in the DCAT version 2. So DCAT version 2, as you can see an image here, it's a bit more extensive than DCAT 1. So the main additions really was we consider a new class that is a resource, and this is a generic entity to catalog anything. So basically now we are allowing DCAT to describe catalogs of other types of entities and not just data sets. And in addition to data set that is a resource, we also added DCAT service as representing a collection of operations that provide access to data sets or data processing functions. So now, as I described that it wasn't possible to describe programmatic access to data, now we do have a class to describe that. In addition, we added more guidance of identifiers, licensing, access rights, how to represent data set quality information, how to relate data sets with other data sets and catalogs, or added in general qualified relations. More properties for the description of temporal and spatial resolution, external references, and make the vocabulary a bit more flexible than it was before. By the way, I should mention that DCAT is what you can call as a fair vocabulary. So all of the terms are described by persistent identifiers, have proper definitions, have descriptions. And by the way, it's also a multilingual vocabulary. So we have, so each of the properties and classes are also described in multiple languages. Okay, so we came with a version DCAT 2 that was published in 2020. And we are currently working towards DCAT 3. And we are always welcoming comments, and we describe at the end how you can do that. But in the new version of DCAT that is coming up, we are including details on how to describe versions of data, a new class for a dataset series. We are adding additions of checksums, inverse property, and several revisions on the specification, as well as including new examples. As I said, this is a working draft at the moment, so comments are welcome. And in the process of W3C, we are still waiting for feedback and implementations for this to really become a recommendation. So please do get in touch with the working group and give us your feedback. So you can, all of the development and the specifications are all open. So I've put links all across the slides, which we will share. And so you can find all the information there. So, so DCAT is now in this process of being in the process of Evergreen standard. So W3C has moved into this notion that of a more agile way of developing standards. So we are always, we have the potential to extend DCAT as required by the communities and to cover different use cases. So yeah, as I said, this is a call for you to participate and provide feedback if that's if you are planning to use DCAT. And with this, I'm going to move on to leave the floor to Peter to describe then where to start if you want to use DCAT. Thank you.
So I think, Peter, you might still be muted. Don't know.
I always make that
Oh,
mistake.
there we go. No, it's
get caught out
yeah,
by
it's quite common. Actually, before you start, maybe we can just pick up. There was one comment in the chat, and I don't know, maybe if maybe we want to pick that up before we move on to the next bit. It was just a comment saying that the distinction between a data set and distribution is a bit problematic in the RDA DMP Common Standard implementation, since it asks for a PID for the data set, not only for the distributions. And just if you wanted to pick up on that, if you had any response to that.
So I'll get round to that sort of thing about where we have IDs and what have you.
Perfect.
As I'm going through.
Excellent, that's great. Well, without any further ado, then I will hand back over to you.
Great, thanks. If I can start off with my first slide, one of the things that we have to deal with early on in dealing with catalogues are decisions about who's going to govern it, what are you going to put in it. Do you need more than one catalogue? Because of course you can have a catalogue of catalogues. These are some of the things that were worked out in the transition, I think, between DCAT 1 and DCAT 2. Initially, we were only talking about something that was for government data, and then people realized, yeah, you can do all sorts of things with it. So you can put lots of things in your catalog. To some extent, it's a real generic opportunity here to use the same sort of model for all manner of different cataloging needs. And because of that, you need to look at DCAT as an interoperability framework, perhaps the lowest common denominator, definitely something that you can use to transit your catalog information between different parties in an easy way. Next slide, please, deals with identifiers. An early consideration is, what are your identifiers schemes, the authority of minting, and so on and so forth. Clearly, what you don't want to be developing is a situation where you've got collisions. And these days, in our interconnected world, using semantic web approaches, HTTPS, URIs are probably a very, very good way to go, although we recognize that there will still be people who have URN schemes, but there are ways in which even people with barcodes these days are beginning to transit to the web. And so think carefully about it and make sure that you're not going to, further down the road, have collisions when you come to be merging catalogs, which is one of the key things that you actually want to be doing with DCAT catalogs. Next slide, please. Now, the important thing about DCAT is that it's not just a tagging scheme. There's actually a model there, there's an ontology. And so that gives you ideas about what the different components are and how they relate and what might contain what. And so we have the cataloging of resources. The cataloging of that and the minting of a resource can also be associated with the creation of a record, which is some sort of note made in the margins about the process of opening a catalog or the process of minting and recording a resource in that catalog. Resources are pretty abstract things. And we've talked already about the fact that there are data sets, resources, and data services as resources. But a resource is an extension point in the DCAT ontology. And so if you want to have, your collection of rocks or trees or whatever, anything that you can put an identifier to, you could create a resource type and then bring that into the cataloging sphere using the DCAT approach. Next slide, please. This is what we've done as we extended the DCAT model in the draft of version 3 to include series. So it gives you the possibility in your own ways of thinking about extending it. Don't think that it's a standard not to be changed around. Alejandra showed you that there are many different flavors of DCAT from version 2, which are being used to give more specialized cataloging within verticals or for countries. Or what we're seeing within the European Union is much more DCAT being used as a basis for other infrastructural resources, such as catalogues of services. Next slide, please. So this is the general pathway. You decide that you're going to create a catalog. As you're creating it and as you're minting identifiers for resources, which may be data sets or series or whatever, you can also be keeping catalog records. And then the rubber meets the road, the place where people see what it is that you're cataloging is in distributions. Now, to attend to this question of PIDs, whether it's for the dataset series, for the distribution, the service, the catalog record, or what, because we operate predominantly in semantic technology, an RDF-based world, we think of persistent identifiers for every one of these entities, which are then joined together within RDF triples by the vocabulary of DCAT and of other semantic vocabularies. And that really is the way that it's been designed. So we would think that everything should have an identifier. Hooks should be on all of your ducks. Next slide, please. Initially, a catalog is going to be empty of resources, but its intention is going to be understood. And then you spend your time gathering resources, deciding what they are, further refining them by updating perhaps the class of them and adding metadata. As Eva was saying, it's about 80% of what goes on in terms of being able to know what something is about is in the metadata. But the other thing that's relevant here is that the class structure gives you the ability to describe more clearly from the class perspective what type of entity we're talking about. And so keep in mind that it's a little bit more than a lightweight tagging scheme, but it's not an overcomplicated ontology either. The way that I've normally done this is to mint IRIs for resources, and then to put them into a pipeline where they get curated, and that pipeline, the progress of an entity along that pipeline gets tracked by adding provenance information. Not only that, it can also follow a pipeline that's described using the P-plan vocabulary. And so what we have is a wide range of semantic assets, different models that are not only the subjects of the pipeline, but we're also using very similar technologies to describe the pipeline, and where all the data that comes from them and all the machinery that's involved in that is going back into the graph. So we use graph technology very widely, so that log files and so on are not just files that get dumped down behind systems only to be used when you're trying to work out if something's gone wrong. Now we feed everything back into the graph in order to give us status, in order for us to find relationships between assets that we hadn't previously understood, and so on. Next slide, please. The key components of a catalog are a whole slew of metadata. We can use terms that come from a wide range of vocabularies in here, albeit the fact that most of the things that we use at the moment that come within the sort of bare bones standard come from Dublin Core and other vocabularies like FOF. But feel free to extend and expand those as you feel that it suits your needs. identifiers for data sets, other resources, including data series. And as we're going through this, if there's a need to make notes in the margins, that's done in the form of a catalog record. Next slide, please. In the same way, a data set has got an identifier and a pile of metadata in the green associated with it. And then a data set will have one or more distributions. It will have an access point that will give some idea of how you can get access to the data set and what distributions there are. And this is usually in the form of an HTML page. Next slide, please. And for a distribution, again, we're talking about some metadata, but we also have a few other specific things. One of them is that we recognize that you may want to find out what a distribution is like. You might want to see the specification, what it conforms to. And this can be done in a myriad of different ways, anything from a textual representation, even in a PDF file or something like that, through to a full-blown schema that describes perhaps at the element level what is within a data distribution, or at the paragraph level what might be in a textual asset. And the other things that you see on the screen there, data services, maybe a way in which one might have a particularly large distribution that you may want to deliver in slices, for example, some geospatial data. And the access point will be one or more ways in which that resource can be accessed using standard web or similar technologies. Next slide, please. So Alejandra at the end was saying that there would be a range of different ways that you would be able to engage with our version 3 development. Alejandra, would you like to describe these, please?
Yes, sure. So in the specification itself, it always provides, there is a section describing on how to get in touch, to propose new use cases even, or highlight any issues with the current versions. So here you have the first link there is the GitHub repository and the list of issues. So feel free to add issues as you see fit. There are all of the meetings and minutes are kept in the open, so you can visit that. There is also always the possibility of you joining the working group, usually through the W3C process. And you can send emails and see previous discussions in the mailing list related to the dataset exchange working group. Is that, am I forgetting something, Peter?
I don't think so. I think that's great. I mean, one of the things that is always the case about W3C, unlike other standards organizations, is that all the meetings are minuted almost as we're going along. And so you're able to go back into the archive there and trek through all of the things that we were talking about. Even that in itself might be an interesting social history. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Over to you, Joy.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think it was great to get a sense of, how DCAT has evolved over the years and how it is incredibly flexible. And I think, one of the key things I've taken away is, number one, I think the transparency around the approach to developing and maintaining it is great, because I think that certainly is something we need for FAIR. But also the fact that it's community driven and that it's flexible and it's designed to kind of reuse what's already there and to be extendable to meet different use cases. I think from your talk too, it was very clear it is well used. This is not something that is unused. There are lots of people already making use of it. And I think one of the really interesting things is the fact that it has gained quite a lot of traction with the government sort of sector, and it's used widely at that level. But as we all know, research data is just a term. You can get lots of research data coming through government channels. So I think looking at it beyond academia is really helpful in that respect. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and I know Alejandra has been kind of busy typing away to some of the responses, but it might be worth just picking them up in case people aren't following the chat. So the first question I think you addressed already about the ID, so that's great. There was a question about how straightforward is it if you've got your catalog in DCAT version 2 to go to DCAT version 3. Is version 2 included in version 3 so that the records can be left as is? So I don't know, Alejandra, if you want to maybe pick that up again, just so that everybody else can.
Yeah, sure. So actually, this is specifically clarified at the very top of the specification. So it's something that I'm sure people will be interested to know, and it's a concern. If you have a version, how do you move to the next one? So we do clarify that the versions are backward compatible. So if you have an implementation on DCAT version 2, it will be automatically DCAT version 3. The only thing is that in version 3, we usually add new elements, or that's, for example, dataset series in this case. So if your catalog requires to describe dataset series, you have a new class that you can use. Otherwise, you don't need to do anything, and you'll still be DCAT compatible with the latest version.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a really important thing to make clear. So everybody, if you're not following the chat, you know that you're not going to be, everything is backward compatible. So I think that gives you confidence as well to make use of this approach. There's a question in the chat. I'm going to try to read it out. And by all means, if I get it wrong, feel free to unmute yourself, John, and pick it up. There was a question in reference to the sort of hooks on all of your ducks. Sentiment that you had said, Peter. So the individual had said that they're an IT and a database developer where they design conceptual, logical, and physical models to then create the tables. Is it safe to say that the hook he would relate to then as the primary key and foreign key constraints in the tables? And apologies if I have not summarized that question correctly, John.
So the answer to that, John, is that you have to really watch that you don't end up with collisions when you're passing your material out to others, or when they're bringing you stuff. And that's why we tend to always have a key that is based on IRIs, URLs, where the namespace helps to ensure that you don't end up with the chance of collisions. And that really is the predominant thing in key choice. The other thing that's really helpful about key choice, and when it is an HTTP IRI, is the fact that you can make use of the DNS to resolve it. So that makes your system potentially just that tiny bit easier to deal with when it comes to global interoperability, if that happens to be the thing that you're after. But yeah, I would be tempted to have something that may be based on your primary key, may also include your foreign key, but probably should also have a namespace and perhaps also the possibility of it being dereferenceable.
That's great. Thanks very much. There was another question. I know you've already answered it as well, Alejandra. It was just about whether in the new version there's been any thought given to alignment with Datasite. So I don't know if you wanted to again raise.
Yeah, I could give a quick summary, and I put a link in the chat on the section on the specification that since version 2 we've added this. So indeed, to be able to cover data citation and the needs for referencing data, the DCAT 2 revision took into account the addition of the referenceable identifiers and creators of catalog resources. And then there is now a direct mapping that can be done in transforming one schema to the other one. And so usually we would build a a citation profile within DCAT that would cover those requirements. So DCAT is very open in terms of what it allows. And as Peter also mentioned, you can add extra vocabulary details as needed. If you want to cover citation specifically, then you need to build a profile that has the constraints that Datasite imposes, like a set of the required metadata fields that Datasite has, for example. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. And indeed, as part of the research data extension, that was something fundamental to consider.
That's great. I think that's been most of the questions then answered in the chat. So I just had one last question to ask for the people attending today. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, I'm going to ask if you can go back to menti.com and enter code 2073. 3730, and I'm going to present this again. And the question I just want to ask for you today is, some of you who joined have data catalogs, some of you don't. I wanted to know, first of all, those of you who do have data catalogs, what are you currently using? So I think some people are using DCAT, some are using Dublin Core. Datasite is coming up as well. There's ISO 19115 code list, which is new for me. I'm not familiar with that one. That's good. So we're seeing, so quite a few of you are already using DCAT. So that's great. So of the people who have catalogs, quite a few of you are already using that. Nexus, I think that's a domain specific option that we did look at in Ferris Fair. And I don't know if anybody on the call wants to say anything about that, but that's great. It's good to see. I'm going to leave that open again. So if people want to continue adding in, that's great for us to try and get a sense of where people are currently using it. The last thing I really wanted to get a sense of today from you before I just wrap up is just to get a sense of, based on what you've heard today, whether you have a catalog or not, do you think that you might take any of the lessons that you've learned today back and either start to look at developing a data catalog or look further into using DCAT as a way to integrate your catalog with others? So how many people think, and again, you can just put free text in there if you like, if you've got any sort of things that you might take away and plan to do when you get back to your day job. Leave it there for a second. So see, we've got a, check new series support as resources. Yeah, that's great. So I mean, hopefully, yes, you've seen that there's lots of ways to feed into the development of version 3. So if you are interested, we would highly encourage you to take a look at it and to provide any feedback through the channels. So I think I'm going to leave that open again. I'll not force you to go through that too much, but please do feel free to continue to add anything into there as you go forward. The last couple of things, just before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you a couple of summing up points. I hope today you found quite useful in at least trying to understand what data catalogs can help with regards to making data holdings visible across multiple repositories. So they really are key in enabling this kind of seamless search and find of relevant data for researchers to reuse. So we hope you've understood that. We hope that you've kind of seen through the presentations from Peter and Alejandra that DCAT does offer quite a lot of potential, we think, to support metadata integration. And I think it's important for us to kind of make a slight distinction. We don't think DCAT is the only thing to use. As we've heard throughout from Peter and Alejandra, it is meant to be used with other standards. And I know quite a few people have already put DDI, CDI into the chat. We did look at this within Ferris Fair as well, and we completely agree. I think we're seeing DCAT as being really key for findability, and that kind of connection with things like DDI, CDI for interoperability. So we do definitely see this as one part of a bigger puzzle. So we would encourage you to kind of go away and think about this. But hopefully you found that useful, and we will make these slides available on the website later along with the recording. But if there are no further questions, I think all that is left for me to do is to thank the speakers for coming along today and sharing your knowledge on DCAT and all of the developments that are going on. And if you do have any other questions that we haven't managed to get a hold of, feel free to get in touch with us and we'll take them offline. But thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today. And good luck as you go back to your repositories and start putting some of this into practice. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
bye.
bye.